Welcome to the To The Point podcast. Now here's your host for To The Point, John Brake.
Welcome to episode 6 of To The Point podcast. My name is John.
And I'm Kelly.
And thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Just real quick before we go into our topic today, I just want to put it out there again. If you have any recommendations, any questions, any thoughts or ideas for this podcast, please shoot us an email, podcast@lifepointlebanon.com. We would be happy to tackle anything you guys want to put out there. So anything you want to say about that before we jump in?
You know, really, these next few podcasts that we're going to do are all addressing questions that people are sending in to ask. And that's what we'd actually prefer. We want to talk about what you want to hear about. And that's the only way we can do that is if you send us a request or send the question in. And it's really, it's good for me to kind of know what's going on in the hearts and minds of people in the church or in the community. And so we would love to have you send whatever your question is. You might even think it's silly, but we can do silly.
Yeah, we love silly questions.
We love silly. But it might be super serious. One of these questions that we're gonna deal with in the next few episodes. In fact, the one we're gonna have today is pretty personal. So we'll definitely keep things confidential if you have any of those kinds of issues. So yeah, we would love to hear your question. It's such an honor to help people deal with what they're struggling with.
Yeah, that's true. And we just. We're excited to jump into some questions that come from people that we go to church with, that we see each week, and we hope that this will be helpful, beneficial to the person who asked the question, but also to everyone who's listening and watching. So we'll jump right in. The question today is, how do you honor your father or mother when they're adamantly opposed to faith, or when they're not honorable in one way or another? So I think first thing, I just want to sort of get your initial thoughts on just that general question. How do you honor somebody? Because we're called to honor our father and mother. Correct. How do we do that in those tough situations?
It's so hard because particularly, the relationship with fathers is so important. The relationship with mothers is, they're both, it's not like one is more important than the other. But it seems that we have an epidemic in our country where we've had more fathers walking away from their kids and walking away from their responsibilities, and that is so damaging to any child. Probably the only thing that is more damaging than that is a father who is actively hurting their children, actively abusing their children on a regular basis. But this is a huge question. We got it that came in for the podcast, but I've been answering this question for years. How do I honor my dad because he did this? How do I honor my dad whenever I am so angry at him? How do I honor my dad when, because there's so many ways. But it's not only men that have dropped the ball here. Whenever a mother walks out on their kids, it leaves a unique kind of a wound, a unique kind of a hurt. But yet, when we read the commands, it's in the 10 Commandments: honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that you dwell in, that God is giving you. That is without. Hey, as long as they meet these qualifiers, you should honor them. But if they don't, that's not the way it's written. It's not the command God gave us. And so, just to kind of talk about this openly, the best way to honor your mother and father is to live an honorable life yourself.
Yeah, that's good.
And that is something that we should all strive for anyway. Now, specifically dealing with the question that came in, this was somebody whose father has been very antagonistic against their faith. And really, I would say, just kind of looking at the tenor and tone of the question, you probably have someone whose father has been very manipulative and controlling in many areas of their life, not just faith, but anything that he took a whim to not agree with at that moment of that person's life. Probably has met significant resistance, and I think that's a pretty safe assumption that's going on here. And so what do you do whenever your parents don't agree with your faith? And that's a challenge, particularly because again, we still have to honor them. Well, what I see and what I've seen happen so many times is that whenever we can live that honorable life, when we can raise kids that are honorable children, I mean, everybody takes pride in that. Whenever you raise a child that is successful and does well, you should feel good about that. Whenever you yourself, whenever you overcome obstacles and you contribute positively to society, you should feel good about that. And as a parent, I've got 4 kids, and as I look at, the kids are getting older now, man, whenever they do something well and it's something they've worked for and they've studied for on their own, I look at that and I'm like, man, that's my son, that's my daughter. What an honor to be their parent. However, whenever we repeat patterns of abuse, or when we repeat patterns of neglect, this doesn't bring honor to anybody. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, this is more common than you would think. A lot of times, the reason why a parent would not want their child to take a next step in faith is that they're jealous or afraid. They're afraid that they're going to lose their child because that's another step they've ever been able to take. Or they're jealous because their child now has friends in the church. Or they're afraid that they're not going to be able to continue to manipulate that kid and control that kid the way they used to in the past. And so I think, going back to the original simple answer, live that honorable life, it's not honorable to continue to allow someone to participate in destructive behavior, even if that destructive behavior is destructive primarily to you. Mm-hmm. I mean, you cannot abuse someone and not end up being abused yourself. You might be the one causing the damage, but when you beat someone down, you're also hurting you. Right. When you tear someone down verbally, you're also hurting you. And so sometimes it's learning how to, with the appropriate level of respect, healthy boundaries, which a book I would highly recommend everybody read is Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend. It should be mandatory reading. You should not be able to graduate high school without reading this book. There are some faith aspects to the book, but and Dr. Cloud and Townsend are both very strong Christians, but it is such a great book regarding friendships and relationships. Another book that we did a series here, you can go back in our podcast archives for LifePoint and check it out. It's called 50 Shades of They. It's all about relationships. It's huge. These are resources that will help you learn how to identify the boundaries that need to be set and then how to put them in place. And I think that's one of the ways that you can honor your parent by saying, hey, I'm not going to allow you to degrade yourself by degrading me anymore. Right. Yeah. And that needs to be said with a measure of humility, not it's not, our job is not revenge. The vengeance is mine. Thus says the Lord. Judgment. It's not even judgment. We're not called to that in this situation. Yeah. We are called to be wise, mm-hmm. and to protect ourselves and protect our children from abuse or from pain. If it can be avoided, we should. But this isn't something that we would, like, hey, I'm not gonna let you see me because you're such a jerk. Right. That tit for tat's not gonna work. It's not effective. But learning how to pick a boundary and then put it in place and then hold them accountable for that, hold yourself accountable for that is pretty big.
That holding yourself accountable can be really tough because we experience a lot of shame and a lot of guilt about setting boundaries with people. That's why I say it's not a judgment thing. We're going through a series on friendship over at Fuel, and it's really, it's about relationships in general, and it can be applied to this. Whenever you have to put a boundary in your life and say, hey, I can't have you for this time in my life, influencing my decisions, influencing my emotions or my spirituality or whatever it might be. It's not so much calling them out as it is calling them up to a different new standard of living. I like that, calling up rather than calling out. I think that's a powerful way to do that. Could we talk about judgment for a second? Because I think this is kind of a key thing. We hear, all the time, you're not supposed to judge, Christians aren't supposed to judge, and those kind of things. There's a difference between making a judgment and pronouncing a judgment. We're not supposed to walk around with a gavel and, crack that. This is it.
But we do need to be able to make some judgments. It's fair and safe to say, hey, he or she has been abusive. He or she has been neglectful. He or she is very likely to do this again. It's fair to say, because of my experience in the past, I'm not going to set myself up for that same experience in the future. There is a judgment that's involved in that, but it's not passing judgment as to whether or not that's a heaven or hell kind of a thing. It's not a telling them, hey, you're a piece of trash or anything like that. There's a difference in making wise judgment. We all do that every day. I don't care who you are, you're making judgments.
Right.
There's a difference in pronouncing judgment. One has a finality to it, and one will lead you to, paths of better health in your relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think going back to that living an honorable life, as you were talking, I was thinking about my own situation with my father. We did not have a good relationship growing up, and he was abusive to my entire family. And so for me, it was there was a lot of just general fear, like with even setting boundaries. Like I didn't even know how to approach that situation. And I remember being, one of my earliest memories, being a little kid and seeing the way that my dad treated my mom. And the only thing I could think was, I want to be a husband and I want to be a dad so I can be the opposite of that.
Sure.
I want to. And now looking back, it may have been a call to living an honorable life because I saw the opposite of that in my father in those times growing up. But really, like, as I started to do those things and put those things into motion, and as I got married and started having children, I kind of reconnected with my dad a little bit, and there was a lot of time had passed. I was no longer just angry. I was no longer just, upset about the things that I'd seen, but I was trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the next path? I always like this idea that the only way out is through. The obstacle is the way. You can't go around the big rock in the middle of the road. You can't go over it. You have to go through it to see growth and see kind of a new life born out of that. And when I would start to try to connect with him, every conversation that we had was him just like pouring out, apologizing, or like at first it was like not really saying anything, like he didn't really want to acknowledge it. And then we would start to kind of peel those layers back and get into it. And then I just saw this deep-seated just embarrassment and shame on his part for being able to look back and see all the damage that he had done. And then also kind of not really knowing how to take, seemingly my successes and my ability to overcome that stuff and to have this family and to do all this stuff. It was almost, I saw that jealousy in that way. Like, he did it better than I did it without me involved in it. And it created a lot of tension, but it was different tension. It wasn't like we were against each other. It's just, we didn't really know how to move on. Well,
it wasn't dragging you down. It was dragging him up. And, and he's had a chance to grow and kind of mature himself, and that's, John, that's really what a big piece of this, because what you're describing is a beautiful act of grace. And as Christians, if we're not focused on grace, then what are we doing?
Right.
Well, why would we even consider ourselves? I don't know if you can rightly apply that title, Christian, if you're not willing to give grace and forgiveness to others. Jesus said, you got to forgive if you're going to be forgiven.
Right.
And that includes parents who've been painfully abusive to you. Mm-hmm. Or, the mother who allowed the boyfriend to go into your room. I mean, this is a scary topic to talk about. We don't just jump there out of the gate, but the fact of the matter is, if we're ever going to get where we need to be, we've got to get to the point where we can forgive people for the worst things they've done to us. Yeah. And if we can't, then we will stay stuck in a mud pit that now we have contributed to. Mm-hmm. Everything else that they've done to us has caused its own issue.
Right.
But as we have grown in Christ, as we have accepted and received his forgiveness for our sins, we have been empowered by the Holy Spirit to embrace that type of forgiveness that he has for us. And if we can't then extend it out to other people, then I don't know if we've actually experienced that, or that we appreciate what Christ has done for us. Because it's hard for us to understand, that hate as a lot of us, if you kind of come up with that, it feels like hate. It doesn't feel like love coming from a parent. Mm-hmm. But we know, because who Jesus is, he said, love your enemies. You don't meet hate with hate. Mm-hmm. You meet hate with love. Love first applies to everything that we do as believers. And so that includes dealing with this in a gracious way. Now, again, there is a wonderful thing called boundaries. We've talked about a little bit today. Putting those things in place, learning how to have the conversation, learning how to not be petty is kind of a big deal.
Yeah, a lot of it for me was learning to own my own story, and not be owned by what I felt like was inflicted or imposed upon me by my father. And
that's a great way to put that, John, because so many times when we've come up with a pretty negative experience, a pretty hurtful experience, particularly as a kid, your experience where you saw that and you said, hey, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be that kind of dad. I don't want to be that kind of a husband. That would be a pretty unique take, honestly, because much of the time, whenever we have that experience, we internalize it. Mm-hmm. If he's acting like this, then I must have done something wrong. I must be a tremendous disappointment. It really is probably my fault. Most kids interpret that kind of behavior as being their responsibility. Most kids, it's very common whenever their parents get divorced. Most kids feel like there's something that they did that caused that. I mean, it's the idea. It's tied into where we're at developmentally as children. That we can. There's this idea that as a kid that you can do anything. Sometimes you have an unrealistic approach to just life, because you're a kid and you don't know any different. But you think, oh, there's something I could have done to have solved this issue or prevented this hurt, or it's actually possible for me to be the kid or the person that they want me to be, the one that never makes mistakes, right. The one that always does the right thing, says the right thing, the one that always has their hair combed the right way, the one that always knows exactly how to respond when they come home. I mean, all those things we internalize, and then that abuse that's put on us, or that neglect, if we're neglected, it's because there's something else that's way more important than us. Now, honestly, as a dad of 4 kids, I don't want my kids to think something is more important than they are in my life. There's only 2 things that are more important than my children, and that's my relationship with God and their mom. And I love to tell my kids all the time, hey, I love you, but I love your mom more. And it's kind of a joke now with our kids, but they also see the value in that. And so, that is something that we've got to look through and kind of just say this. There is absolutely nothing wrong. If you've got some struggles in this area, there's nothing wrong with talking to a counselor. Oh, yeah. I've done it. And I think I highly advocate having a relationship with a counselor or a therapist. You don't have to be in the worst of the worst places before you go talk to a counselor or a therapist. In fact, if you do it early, you might not get to that worst of the worst place. And so I highly advocate. We even have the community counseling partnership in place to help people in our church get the help that they need. So I highly advocate that we take the time to do that, because this is really one of the major significant issues of our lives. It's knowing who we are, knowing how to navigate the things that we've been through that are really defining for us. And we can do that successfully, or we can do that non-successfully. And there's a huge difference between the two.
Right. And if anybody would like any information about the community counseling partnership, you can call the church office here, or you can check out our website and talk to any of us on Sunday morning after church. We'd love to get you connected in any way with that. When we were talking about just a few ideas of how to honor them through that, how to honor your father and your mother through what seems to be a dishonorable season or dishonorable life, or just being opposed to faith. I was thinking prayer is probably the best way that you can start. They may not even ever know that you're praying for them. They might know. It might be something that you even do together, because a lot of the confusion surrounding that can come from people who have parents who claim faith but don't seem to live that out in their lives. But I think a good place always to start would be prayer. as you are seeking to live an honorable life. I think that's a big part of it. And I believe that just pursuing prayer at every turn for them, for you, for the emotions surrounding that, and then to seek to understand their story. That was a big turning point with my father too. And I think for anybody who has, father issues, mother issues, to seek to understand where that comes from, because that helped me put into perspective that it wasn't me.
Yeah.
Because there was a lot of authority and submission issues in their life growing up. They wanted to feel, my father, he wanted to be in control of his destiny. He wanted to be in control of the situations and the people that he surrounded himself with, because he was so hurt and abused himself.
Right.
And his only way of doing that was to mimic and to reproduce what was inflicted on him when he was a kid. And it wasn't until I was much older. It was after my parents got divorced, and I actually stumbled upon, I don't know if you call it snooping or what, but I stumbled upon some journals because he had started to see him and my mom.
Reading your dad's journals is snooping.
Is that what that is? I don't know. Okay, well, we'll call that snooping. call it for what it is. Research. I was researching my dad. But they had started to see a therapist. They were trying to figure out what was going on with all of the different issues that my dad had been struggling with. And I was helping my mom. How the snooping happened was I was helping my mom kind of clean out the room, and I just found these notebooks. You just start looking through stuff. It was like the Goonies when they go up in the attic and finding all this stuff. And I'm like, whoa, treasure map. I found my dad's brain, basically.
Wow.
I'd never had these conversations with him. He was never open with me. I was the youngest and the only boy, and I was totally different than my dad. So it became this thing where he's like, I want to be able to impart all this wisdom, and because my dad is very smart, he knows what he's talking about when it comes to, especially when it comes to cars and stuff like that. But I wanted to write poetry and play guitar.
Right.
So totally different.
Yeah.
That's what I did. It worked out. Not really. But anyway, I found these notebooks and I started reading them. It was just like, wow, this is every answer to every question that I would have ever had. But he was too embarrassed and ashamed to talk to me about it.
And that's one of the things that we often forget. When someone has really put a lot of pain into our lives, that's all we can see. We don't think for a second that they may have had pain.
Right.
Or even if we do, because our pain is so blinding. When you're in pain, that's all you can see is your pain. Mm-hmm. We don't think about what they may have gone through that would have led them to do this. The beautiful thing about prayer is that prayer may not change the heart of the person you're praying for, but it'll change your heart. Mm-hmm. Whenever you pray for somebody, your heart gets melded more closely with God's. And in that process, you will become more loving to them, no matter what they've done. You will become more loving to them. And that love is what unlocks the door so you can pursue that forgiveness. So you can pursue that reconciliation as far as that reconciliation can go. And that's, let's talk about that for just a second. Forgiveness in itself, particularly for someone who has been through the worst of the worst, that's not a pleasant thing to think about. And there's different levels of forgiveness. And there's an old teaching that I've heard, that forgiveness could be defined as taking your hands off someone else's throat.
That's good.
That hey, you're going to be able to have thoughts about that person, your father, your mother, your uncle, whoever it was that caused the harm. You're going to be able to have thoughts about that person that don't include revenge. You're going to be able to have thoughts about that person that would be actually for their good. It doesn't mean that you're going to be, hanging out and spending, the holidays together again or anything necessarily, because that's not always possible. But it does mean that you're not going to want bad for their life. And that's a game changer for us. That's a massive game changer. And from there, reconciliation becomes more and more possible. And there again, it may not be. Sometimes there's people out there, and that there's one of the books that I read in my counseling practice was called Toxic Parents. There are some people out there, John, they're just toxic.
Can't be changed, won't be changed.
Can't be changed. They will not change. You could come up with the best verbal interaction with them and hit every note just perfectly.
Yeah.
And out of spite, they will throw it back in your face. And that's just the way it's going to be. And they're not going to be any different. And we have to learn how to deal with these different people, irregular people. Most people aren't like that. Most people have regret over what they've done, but they don't see it until after it's been done, of course. Right. But whenever we take time just to kind of realize, hey, there's some people in our lives that are just that way. So what do you do about that? One of the most helpful things to do is change your expectation.
Yeah.
Expectations
are
it's huge.
A big part of it. Yeah.
It's huge. But if your experience has been, hey, every time I reach out to them, every time I try to please them, they're not happy with me, they find something else to be upset with, then that's what you can expect. Stop expecting them to go, oh, wow, you're wonderful. Yeah. I'm so proud of you. I mean, if they've not done it so far and you're, 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, they might not ever do it. Mm-hmm. And that's not on you. That's on them. So change your expectation. Begin to look at things and say, you know what? I'm not expecting them to show up. I'm not expecting them to care. I'm not expecting them to tell me that they love me. Mm-hmm. You may want those things, but if you don't expect them, if you change and manage your expectations, then it takes some of the pain away from your heart.
Mm-hmm. And I think you can also you can change your expectations, but also raise your expectations of yourself.
Yeah.
So whenever I'm thinking of my 3 kids, like the stuff, I made it a point from the start, and I'm still working on it. And there's areas where I totally fail, and there's areas where I'm doing okay. And, there's always a progression of how you're doing, especially as a parent, because kids are awesome.
They are awesome, yeah.
But, when you raise your expectations, you raise the bar for yourself, and you say, I'm not going to fall into that. Mm-hmm. Or if I see myself moving toward that, I'm going to intentionally take steps. We talked at the beginning of the year about goals. Every year on my goal list is there's something about my kids. There's something about how I'm investing time in my wife and my kids. And that's intentional because I know that I don't want to fall into that default mode, even if it wouldn't be necessarily abusive. It might be neglectful. It might be emotionally distanced or something like that. And I want to stay connected, and I want to stay where I'm investing in my kids because I know what it's like to not have that.
Yeah.
And I think that can be a game changer too. You change your expectations, and also part of that is don't expect other people's expectations to change. They might still expect more of you. They might not respect your boundaries. They might not get on board with what you're trying to do, but you can change your expectations of that and then raise your own expectations of yourself. Now we're getting pretty close. We have a few more minutes here. I think it would be cool to talk about just some one-off kind of response kind of questions. Like, how do you respond to a father who maybe is, when it comes to dealing with your faith, say you're a person of faith and your father or your mother is not, and you're talking about that, you're living this life, trying to live an honorable life, and they're calling you, brainwashed, or they're calling you, blinded by the church, or what have you, all those types of things. How do you respond?
The best way to respond in that situation is the same way where we see in Revelation 12:11. They overcame by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. I mean, that's how they overcame the devil. You can overcome your dad. Look at your testimony. You're being brainwashed by the church. Yeah, but I'm happy. Yeah. You're being brainwashed by the church. I'm not using drugs anymore. This is going on. I have peace in my life for the first time. You start telling the story of what God has done, and guess what? It's not the church. It's what God has done. We get to be a part of what God does, but God's the one who does the changing. And so we just tell our testimony.
Do you think that kind of question, those types of claims, come from that place of insecurity and the lack of submission, the fear from that person? Where do you think that comes from to have that mode where you're just going to automatically, by default, just not ever give any credence to anything that goes on from a faith perspective in someone else's life?
I think, unfortunately, it comes from several places. Let's just be honest. We've had a lot of people in the church that have claimed to be Christian, but they have certainly not been Christ-like. And that's a real issue. I have people in my life, dear friends, even some family members who have been very horrifically abused by clergy. And so their mistrust of the church and of pastors in particular, it's well-deserved. So that's part of it. Some people, they have just a genuine mistrust of everything. They're just skeptical and suspicious of everything. And so it's not just the church. They also didn't trust your teachers or your principals at your school. Right. You know, they don't trust any of their employers. You know, they don't when they're driving by, they see a policeman there, they automatically think that person's there waiting on them.
Every doctor's a quack.
Every doctor, yeah. And but they would have a general opposition to authority in their life, no matter where they see it. And so unfortunately, there are a lot of real reasons why people would have that issue, that they've had experienced. They've been hurt by somebody. They know someone who's been hurt. They saw some pastor somewhere. And I'll say it like this, and I don't know this situation, in and out, but I've been told many times by guys who have come through the prison system here at church, hey, the people that go to church in prison, they're the ones who maybe have been guilty of some of the more heinous crimes, particularly against women and children. And so they don't want to be associated with that at all. But the reason why they go to church is so they can have safety and protection in that location. And so they see that and they think, oh man, the hypocrisy, I don't want to be associated with that at all, And so there's a lot of reasons. But understanding why they might think that can be helpful to a point. What they really need is to see the love and light of Jesus Christ in our lives. That's what really makes a difference.
That's good. I have one last question about this. I think this would be good for people to kind of see the other side of it. So you have a situation like this, a mother or father who are, far from God or think they're close to God or whatever, but they start to seem like they're making progress, seem like they're taking steps to live a different way, or at least accept your way of life. How would you encourage someone to not fall into skepticism, or what's a healthy amount of skepticism for somebody to have when they've had this life of abuse inflicted upon them, or manipulation or control or whatever, and they're worried that might just be another one of those?
It's not really, it isn't very hard. It's pretty simple to understand. The Bible says you'll judge them by their fruit, right? You will know they are my disciples by the way they love one another. Those are things that we can easily see. And if you think about it just as in judging fruit, I don't know about you, but when I go to a salad bar, I look at the stuff before I put it on my plate.
Scoop it blindly.
Yeah, I'm going to grab the stuff that I make sure that I actually want to eat that, and if it's rotten and nasty looking, it doesn't really matter what the label says it is. I'm not touching it. And there's there's some crossover there as we think about not just parents but anybody, in faith. If it looks like it's kind of rotten and nasty inside, if we see not the fruit of the Spirit but the fruit of the world, of the flesh, then we probably want to keep some distance there. Right. We can continue to pray. We can continue to love. We can continue to share our story, what God is continually doing in us. But as we see the fruit emerge, as we see that blossom begin to bloom and then turn into that fruit that can one day be picked, it may not be ripe yet, but if it's growing, we want to encourage it. Just like we would any plant or vegetable in the garden, we want to encourage that. And so we want to make sure that we're not one of the pests that keep it from developing. We want to make sure that we're not one of the birds that come and pluck it off the vine. We want to make sure that we're not one of the weeds or the rocks that choke it out or keep it shallow. Mm-hmm. We want to do all that we can do to encourage that positive behavior.
Right. And that's part of living that honorable life is
in
those moments still being able to past your own history with that person, past your own preconceived ideas of what that person could be. People change. We're on a path. We're in progress all the time, and that could very well be an answer to prayer that you're writing off as another attempt to pull one over on you or whatever. So that's good. Any last thoughts before we wrap this one up?
I think we just got to remember to love people, even particularly the people that have hurt us. But that's a lot harder to do than it is to say sometimes, particularly when it's someone as close as a parent.
And I think as much grace as you need to develop for other people, you need to have that same grace on you to understand that you're on a journey too, and to keep working at it, keep trying your best to honor your father and mother while keeping healthy boundaries and keeping an understanding of they're a different person, they're on a different path than you, but prayer, living an honorable life, and try to understand their story. I think those are 3 very helpful things for this. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you for watching. If you would please subscribe, please share this, review it on iTunes or Google Play or wherever you listen to your podcasts, and send in questions, podcast@LifePoint Lebanon. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks guys.
Thank you for listening to the To The Point podcast from LifePoint Church. For more information about LifePoint, visit us on the web at lifepointlebanon.com. Be sure to subscribe and rate this podcast, and be sure to share it with your friends on social media. Thanks for joining us for To The Point.